today we'll be talking about knowledge is the new uranium, and we'll get into a little bit of what that means, but let's just hop right into it. So this comes initially from a quote that you may have heard that was coined by a guy named Clive Humby back in 2006. You see it behind you. It says, "Data is the new oil." And the idea behind that is that much as oil powered the economies of the world in the 1900s and led to great change, but also, great destruction in various wars and things, that we were entering a new era where it would not be oil, but it would be data that powers the modern economy. And so, we've seen this play out. A lot of companies have taken this to heart. And it's something that we think about a lot on my team at MongoDB. And, there's, I think, two parts and two ways that you can take this quote. And so the first one is that we need to get a lot of data. That's the only way that we're going to succeed. But I think that's a bit of a misinterpretation of what Clive meant when he said this. And so the real intent behind this is that just like oil, it's very powerful and it can power an economy, but if I just give you a tank of oil, what are you going to do with that? You need to do something more. You need to process it and refine it and make it useful. And so we like to take this on my team to the next level by talking not about data, the new oil, but modernize it even more. And we like to say that knowledge is the new uranium. So we'll get into that in the next half hour, but first I just want to introduce myself. Who am I? Who is my team? I work at MongoDB. We're a database cloud platform. Anything you need with data, AI, we've got it. So come check us out. We're in the sponsor pavilion as well. First, right next to the food. You can't miss us. And then over there on the right side, you see some of the projects that I work on. I'm on our education team, and so I work a lot with our education content, as well as putting like an AI chatbot on our documentation, making a framework for other folks to build chatbots, and then some other knowledge management work that my team does outside of direct applications that I'd like to talk about too. And so this is the agenda for today. We're just going to go through a little bit of, we're talking about data and knowledge. We're going to go through a little bit of what the differences are, how my team and other teams are using these things, some potential ways that they might go wrong, and then hopefully look forward towards a brighter future. So let's go ahead and get into it, starting with data and knowledge. So first off, what is knowledge? I guess sort of along the same lines as that quote or what I was talking about is knowledge is something that has a little bit more context to it. It's got information. It's synthesized to have a useful purpose. And it's used everywhere in the modern AI landscape, right? LLMs run on knowledge from all these different areas. So when we're writing applications that use LLMs, training the base models, fine-tuning models, or writing even more complex applications, the things that drive these and make them useful are the additional knowledge and the use cases that we have that we can put into them. So the knowledge that we have is pretty fundamental. And as you're at this conference, you've probably heard of retrieval-augmented generation and things like that. It's really shaping up to be key that you need to have more than just the base models. And so as an example of what we mean by knowledge, on the left side, you can see some data, maybe from like a weather or forecast API about the temperatures and the weather in San Francisco today. And that's great, but if I just hand you a big blob of JSON, what are you going to do with that? But on the right, you see the same information, but presented in a way that's actually a bit more what I would call knowledge, and that it synthesizes all of this data together and tells you the story about why it actually matters. So you'll know more than just some Fahrenheit measurements. You'll know about an average temperature and what the climate in San Francisco is like, and maybe even a recommendation like, hey, you should probably wear a jacket if you don't want to be shivering on your 5 a.m. walk over to the Embarcadero. So that's just kind of like a high-level view, and you can imagine this applying to really any domain where you have data and then some more information about it. So what kinds of knowledge are there? Well, there's low-quality knowledge, and I think this is pretty easy to get there and is actually probably something that's baked into a lot of the LLMs that we use every day because, frankly, not that we know exactly what all of these model providers are doing, but I think there's doing a lot of wide scraping with not so much discrimination. And so you probably get a lot of low-quality knowledge baked into your base models. And that's things that just, frankly, are a lot of fluff. They don't have much information in them. They are perhaps wrong or outdated. They only talk about part of the issue, or they are just from from some source that you shouldn't necessarily trust because they might have some ulterior motive or something like that. So you see examples there, just raw chat logs, SEO spam, blog posts, social media posts that is a person's opinion or is unstructured. And I want to contrast that with high quality knowledge, which is a little bit more structured, things that have more information density and that have a little bit of a logical format. And I might be a little personally biased here because I spent most of my professional life working in technical documentation, but I do want to advocate for technical documentation. First party, trusted, comprehensive, up-to-date sources are really going to be the key to building quality AI applications that actually like do what you want them to do and provide useful help. So knowledge, very important. And then as far as going from in that same idea of oil is only useful if you refine it, similarly, you can go mine up uranium out of the ground, but it's the turning it into something that's actually useful for energy production that is an important process. And so we'll stretch the metaphor a little bit here. So we'll see we can start off with a process where we're going out and finding data and then pulling it into our systems, and we need to do a good job of managing this knowledge. And so then part of this process is not all of the base information that we'll have access to is going to be high quality knowledge in the first place. And so we can either just accept low quality knowledge, or we can do some work in the middle, some transformations. This might look like a more traditional extract, transform, and load pattern if you're familiar with databases. Very similar idea. While we're pulling data from these data sources, we can do some cool stuff to enhance them and hopefully turn them from lower quality sources into higher quality sources. And so with that, I'm thinking about things like you can even use AI as part of this process. So you can do, for example, LLM summarization of incoming data, or LLM as a judge to do quality checks and things like that, or is this from a trusted source? And just get a bit more information on what you're pulling in to your systems. So we're pulling in the data, and now we're thinking about good knowledge and what we have. But what are we actually applying this to? So I'd just like to go through some of the use cases that we have for knowledge at MongoDB, and then some of the ways that we can apply them. So the first one that I think you probably come to mind whenever AI is mentioned is like a chatbot. And this is something that I work on at MongoDB. You'll see a picture of it there. Is we have a chatbot for our documentation. And so this is sort of a direct way to like talk with the knowledge that you have in your system, right? There's all sorts of techniques you can do to prompt chatbots, and you can do agentic things to take them down different directions. But fundamentally, what you're doing here is having a conversation with some knowledge or some information that you have and trying to synthesize new information out of it. So this can be a combination of an ecosystem of tools. You can build it in-house, but ultimately, chatbot, unless you can either basically ship the base model, you can ship ChatGPT, or you can make it something that's special for you. But what we're actually seeing is that chatbots are maybe like the first use case that people come up with, but maybe not the most useful or most widely used use case. So another area that we're seeing a lot of traction in is with in-product features, and that's less about AI in your face talking with the knowledge, and it's more leveraging the knowledge that you built up to actually be useful in other ways. So for example, here we might have a lot of knowledge about MongoDB specifically, how to write different queries, what operations are available, what your collections schema is, what your data actually looks like, and we can take all of this knowledge and put it together and have something greater than just the base LLM, right? So something sort of like RAG, but it's also based on that knowledge base that we've accumulated. And I touched on it can use your schema, and I think this is where a lot of power comes in, and potentially like an underexplored area is really tying in personal user level details into these generation processes. And then that's like highly personalized knowledge is how you can think about it, and it'll really help you make cool features. So another one is sort of in between, and this is like sort of the bread and butter that I've been focusing on, is not directly chatting with your data, but also not in service of like another product as a feature, but really we want to create something new, and we want to make good tools for like content authors. And so I mentioned I work in documentation. This is something we're super interested in, is how do we not replace the human in the loop, right? I think it's very important to have, for high quality knowledge, someone who is actually really an expert, but how do we make it so that their job is more applying their expertise and less staring at a blank page trying to come up with content? So applying the knowledge that we already have, plus potentially new knowledge that we're generating on the fly about, say, like a new product feature, or we're adding AI into the product. Like, how do we think about that? So putting together generative content tools that let us synthesize what we already know, as well as new information that's coming out, and put them into a format that we want. So we're looking at things like generating documentation pages, generating quiz questions, and a key thing here is that we ultimately want to control the structure, know what's going in, know what's going out, and then solve specific issues with them. And then the final thing that we're doing is less related to like building AI applications ourselves and more understanding and benefiting what's out there in the ecosystem. So let's say you are building your own app and you want to have some knowledge about MongoDB. We could have all this curated knowledge that we're putting into our own applications and kind of gatekeep it and hold it back as a thing that's proprietary and special about us. But we sort of view it as an opportunity to improve the knowledge out there in the world. So we're putting together things like training data sets that to help crystallize really specific knowledge about MongoDB that base models might have trouble with. And so this is partially based on just our content that we have as well, content we already have, as well as trying to synthesize new areas and identify new gaps and put this out there. So a bunch of different product features as well as training data sets to help improve other products. So with those use cases in mind, we're going to continue stretching this uranium metaphor, and we're going to get into some of the ways that it can go wrong if you're not mindful about your knowledge management process. And so I've been calling these nukes and meltdowns. And we'll start off with the nukes, very visceral here. And the idea is obviously that nukes are pretty malicious. If somebody is doing this, they intend to cause you harm, and that's things like exfiltrating confidential information, ransomware, leaks. These are things to be aware of. And there's really high potential for damage when you're doing curated knowledge. But also these types of things that are like leaks are visible, and you'll probably catch them if they happen. It's obviously not a good day if you found out that somebody's been exfiltrating data from your system, but you'll probably know once you know. And so we can do some stuff that is probably not new if you've been developing applications to take care of this, or at least try and guard against it. But something that you should always be mindful of is that just with any application, you need to secure this and make sure that data is only available to those who really need access to it. So that means things like role-based or attribute-based access controls, robust systems like that. And it also means, maybe even more directly siloing data. So for example, in MongoDB, we have a lot of public data that we publish to our documentation. You can go look it up right now. So as far as like publishing that in a data set, that's already out there. That's fine. But then there's things like your database's schema, and we don't want to put that in a data set. There's things like new features that we're developing that are not public yet, that might be useful for an internal audience, but aren't necessarily things that the public should know about. So you could put all those together and then rely on access controls, but I think an even better approach is just strict siloing of public and private data, and then you're a lot more protected as long as those silos are enforced. So, security, much in the same way that we protect access to, fissile materials like uranium, you want to protect access to your knowledge base and system. And the other way that things can go wrong is, less visible, but potentially even more harmful. And that's something like a nuclear meltdown, where there's not a big bang, but something goes wrong, and you might not even notice that it's happening until you start suddenly getting big radiation poison, right? And that is not a malicious leak, but let's say your chatbot just decides to start saying, "Hey, MongoDB is announcing this new feature next week. Aren't you excited?" And if we don't, have good visibility into what our chatbot is saying, or what kind of queries we're generating, or what we're putting into our generated content, then there's no way for us to know that this is happening. And we're just slowly leaking information, and harm is getting out there, and we're lucky if we can find it. So we need to be mindful of both types of things. And so for meltdowns, what we do is, you just heard a whole talk, if you were in here at the last session, about evaluations. And this is a major area that we're working on right now. So we sort of split evaluations into two different I guess, topic areas. So this one, evaluation and observability, is really about internal things. So for example, our docs chatbot. And we can peer into like all the different layers. Maybe you saw like a trace of an LLM call. All these different areas we can peer into and say, well, how does that perform? Did we find the right search results to match the user's question? And then did the AI answer based only on those search results? And was it still relevant? And there's all sorts of different dimensions that we can check in there. So we need to build out ways to ensure that, A, we have visibility into what our own systems are saying at every level, and measuring that with every change that we make. And then that applies at both runtime, so we want to make sure that we're not necessarily like leaking information at runtime, but also just as a regular scheduled evaluation, and say just every week, what's the state of our system, how are we doing, as well as I'm making this very targeted change, or we're going to ingest this entire new section of knowledge. How does that affect our responses? And that's the kind of thing that we want to keep track with in terms of evaluations internally. And then the other side of that is, well, there's AI out there that's not under our control, right? I don't know how ChatGPT works under the hood necessarily. I can guess, excuse me. But as far as like an LLM trace or something that shows you every step of the way, that just doesn't exist. So really, on the external systems, what we're looking at is more of a black box. Input goes in, output comes out. And what we'd like to understand is, how do they answer? Like, what knowledge does ChatGPT have about MongoDB? And then, that's I think a tough question, because folks probably are, I built this chatbot, but if I'm going to be honest, folks are probably just going to go to ChatGPT more than like come to our documentation. So we really want to make sure that ChatGPT and other services are giving good answers. So we design evaluations that are targeted at these sort of black box systems, and we consider these to be benchmarks. And so these are less looking at the internals, and they let us just get a broad class of classifications about how models can perform. So for example, some stuff that we're running right now is we have a bunch of quiz questions that we use on MongoDB University just to check understanding. And so we've compiled those into sort of a mega quiz, and then we prompt the LLMs to take the quiz. And then they get standardized scores back, and we can compare them. And that's a way to benchmark LLMs. We're not saying that's the only way. But that's one way to think about how do these perform on MongoDB. Another one that we're looking at implementing right now is if I go to ChatGPT or a Gemini and I say, write me a MongoDB query that does this, does it generate valid MongoDB queries that actually run in the language that you asked for? Like, no idea. So we're going to be putting together a benchmark to do that. And various other things, like if I ask for what's a good database, and I don't mention MongoDB at all, does the LLM model mention MongoDB? And if it does it say, don't use MongoDB? Because then we really got a problem. So we really want to be able to know, what do they say, how are they talking about us, and then measure these things over time. So that's what we use benchmarks for, and we're constantly thinking of new benchmarks and kind of evaluating the industry as a whole to see what other folks are measuring. But that's what we're looking at as far as benchmarks. So that's how we kind of handle the negative cases and make sure that we're doing good things or not making actively harming things. And then I just want to take the last portion here to kind of talk about looking forward, what can we do to use this to power a brighter tomorrow in spite of these potential downfalls. So the first thing is sort of what I was talking about here, and this applies, I think, both to internal and external systems, this sort of virtuous cycle here, where we have some corpus of knowledge, let's say the MongoDB documentation, developer blog articles, our video series that we put out. And so we have this whole corpus that we're going to feed into the LLMs. And that might mean direct partnership with the model providers, or it might mean putting up documentation that's got thorough information and is really good at being scraped by a web scraper. And that, I think, in our experience, that's actually the approach there. Depends on the cloud and LLM provider that you're working with. Everybody's got different opinions and methods there. And then we've got this system that we've put knowledge into. We need to evaluate it and determine how well it does on various cases. And then we'll get some scores back. And then we need to do some analysis on those scores and say, well, it aced this, and then it failed at this, or we don't know how it does at this. Basically do a gap analysis and use that to drive the roadmap. And that lets us create new content that we can feed into the LLMs and do evaluations on, and then identify gaps. And then you get sort of this flywheel flywheel virtuous cycle going. So this is sort of our goal, and where we're taking knowledge management at MongoDB, having some kind of cycle like this. And so then we want to think about who we're actually doing this for. So this will really benefit, I think, the human builders out there. That's all of you, because ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're doing here is creating better content. We're writing new documentation or updating our documentation, creating new courses, new articles for new technologies that actually help. If you go on Google and you find these articles, you can read them. And you don't have to know that it was driven by this LLM process. We're just putting new article or new content and knowledge out there in the world. But there's also a rising class of AI agents and robot builders, and we want to make sure that they have access to all of this too, because it's almost more important. Because you may have heard something about MongoDB and it's in the back of your head, but these AI agents are perhaps a little bit more robotic, and so you need to give them access to these resources and help them really understand what they're working on. And so we want to think about how our knowledge is exposed to agents as well. So I guess just like the final thought here is maybe we want to progress towards something that's a bit more of like a curated knowledge service. And this is a way that we can both manage kind of all that knowledge management stuff I've been talking about, but then also make it available, whether that's in the form of raw documentation that's easily searchable, synthesizing across different documentation sets, or directly having a chat with documents saying, hey, what's going on here? How do I do this thing? Generate me this new code example. And we think that there's probably an opportunity here to sort of centralize these into a single service that helps human builders, AI builders, everyone know more and build better with MongoDB. So that's the end of the talk, and then it wouldn't be a good sponsor talk without a shameless plug at the very end. And while I am a bit biased here, I actually do think that MongoDB Atlas and the MongoDB data platform, I'll say it's the best platform. It's among the best platforms for building modern AI applications, just because it really has everything that you need. Helps you move quickly, helps you gain insights into what you're working on. So if you want to learn more about that, stop by our sponsor booth. We're right back next to the food downstairs, so you can't miss us. And thanks for the time. I'm happy to take some questions now or in the hallway.
Thank you, Nick. We have time for a question or two. Chris in the back has a microphone, so raise your hand and make eye contact with Chris. Nick must be very clear.
So I run an IT school, so we provide training for information technology. Mm-hmm. How I can use your product? As like to create IT tutor or something?
How to use MongoDB in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you do any work with databases or database platforms in general? Like SQL or relational databases?
No.
So I guess step one would be kind of think about how databases, in any IT environment, you need basically an application, website, anything, you need somewhere to store the data. So I would think about how like an IT school, how you're communicating that to students, talking about data management. And then MongoDB is like a very general purpose data management platform. So storing data in the database, great. Doing search, great. I think it's really like at that point, once you've introduced like the idea of a database, like very use case specific, what kind of work are you doing with the database? And then you can talk about it practically that way. Does that make sense? Right.
For like, say you were doing government records, mm-hmm. and you're national, like not just city, how was MongoDB help?
Yeah, so I mean, I think regardless of the scale there, like it's a great flexible platform for like storing data. So like, particularly for government records, I know MongoDB Atlas has some like FedRAMP compliance built in. It's a thing that you are legally allowed to use on government applications, which is great. But yeah, I think it's just like I don't know that like necessarily the day-to-day aspects of like storing data would change that much, whether the topic is like state, federal government. Like obviously the actual data you're storing and the modeling is different, but like that's part of the power and the flexibility is that whatever your use case is, if you can model it in code in like a JavaScript object or a Python dictionary or similar, hash map, whatever, then it's something that you can model and store and work with in MongoDB.
We have time for couple more questions. There's a question.
Sorry, we had one too. Thank you for presenting.
Sure.
Just want to say, like, you caught a very good point where when you present, this is going to be a nightmare scenario for future companies where they have their product, they have their documentation, and they want those results to show up in LLM, the output. And you don't, and the common thread for those LLM machine learning is data poisoning. So somebody can just spawn an extremely similar web page with like MongoDB and just set bad at the end. And so what are kind of your mitigation strategy with like those?
Totally.
Yeah.
I think that kind of gets into my slide about like bad knowledge or low quality knowledge, right? That's like I can spam out SEO blog posts, and if I'm not a very reliable actor, then like that's low quality. And so step one is to know that that's even happening, right? And that the way that would manifest is like I'm asking these questions, and despite all of our best efforts, MongoDB the AI is telling us, you know, whatever the data poisoning pill or whatever is saying. So like, honestly, it's a pretty broad space. So I think there's work to be done in making sure that you have robust controls around that. But like step one is noticing. And then I think most of these AI model providers are like fairly open to the conversation. So you can probably talk with them about that. And then yeah, it's really the Wild West in terms of this stuff. So like, I don't have a hard answer for you other than put more better content out there and then work with the people to not ingest the poison. But step one is find out that there's poison in the first place.
So final question.
Hey, Nick, you talked about platform perception of your product, and I think that's interesting because we haven't heard a lot of people kind of talk about that perspective. Knowing that that's kind of out of your control, how do you actually act on that information, and how do you see, and how should other organizations using AI also think about it?
Yeah, I think it's not totally out of our control, but it is a very, very long cycle relative to like the internal evaluations where we can run it and then within a couple minutes see the results and say, all right, let's iterate on that. We're talking more on the, you know, whatever the cycle is for LLM training and updates from the providers is what we're working with here. So I think, you know, kind of step one is just understand that it'll be a slower process. But hopefully over time you can measure some, you know, form some hypotheses, do some experiments with content and measure some real change. But then the other thing is, you know, we're doing this for the AI builders, of course, but in the meantime, if you're identifying these content gaps and you're going through and you're like, oh yeah, we actually don't have any docs on that, and then we write a new docs page about it, you know, regardless of if our LLM users are actually getting that info, you know, now or 6 months from now, it's helpful to human users coming in from Google the moment we publish it. So I think it's also important to realize that there's like intermediate wins along the way, and it's not just ChatGPT is wrong or right about us.